I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on chaotic fighting in the Donbas town of Torestsk as Russia continues its grinding offensive there. Vladimir Putin announces a surprise summit with Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian in a move that could further enmesh the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. And we hear from Oslo about why the Norwegian government is cutting aid to Ukraine despite fears Russia may test NATO in the Arctic.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 8th of October. 2 years and 232 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Russia correspondent James Kilner and Jørn Sund-Henriksen, leader of the Norwegian Ukrainian Friendship Association and co-host of the podcast Ukrainapodden. I started with the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia. So in the Kursk region, Ukraine has reportedly maintaining or continuing to assault Russian positions near several villages. We've heard the names of Novy Put, Vasilyevaya, Lubimovka and Plehova. The Russians also continuing their counteroffensive is what they're calling it, in some of the same areas. We've had reports they have managed to advance actually near Plehova and east of Kremanoye and Zhuravli. So events there in the balance. Elsewhere, it is a story pretty much, as far as we can tell, of those incremental Russian advances up and down the line. So in Kharkiv region, Russian forces have put in attacks near that lodgement near Vovchansk, up on the border, kind of northeast of Kharkiv city, but not much movement reported. They're continuing to assault on the Kupiansk front. They're getting very close to reaching the Oskil River and splitting the Ukrainian bridgehead there in two, which is something they've been clearly aiming to do for months. They've been moving ahead at a snail's pace, but we're now looking at only a few kilometers before they reach the banks of the river. So probably operationally, already that Ukrainian bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Oskil, probably effectively in two parts. Now, moving south, we've got reports of Russia putting in assaults near Seversk, down into the Donetsk region, near Chasiv Yar, and importantly in Torestsk, that hilltop mining town kind of southwest of Chasiv Yar and of Konstantinovka, basically. Now, we have confirmation the Russians are definitely inside Torestsk itself, but the fighting there is chaotic. It's difficult to tell which parts of the town are held by who. I have seen reports referring to particular streets, but I think at this stage it would probably be a disservice to actually try and give you anything that exact, because I think the fog of war is, as is natural in these kind of close combat urban environments, very, very thick. We did have this from Anastasia Bobovnika, a spokeswoman for the Operation Tactical Group Luhansk, on Ukrainian television yesterday. She said, here's a quote, "The fighting is taking place within Torestsk itself. The situation is unstable. Fights are taking place literally at every building entrance." So that gives you a sense of the combat there. Now, further south, we really get into the area where the Russians are putting in their main effort and have been for weeks and months, really. So the Russian Defense Ministry today say they've, in their words, liberated two villages in the Donetsk region, the villages of Zoryanya and Zolotoniva. Both of these are southwest of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk obviously being their big kind of next tactical target that they've been pushing towards for weeks, but in slightly different places. So Zoryanya is in that exposed Ukrainian salient we've talked about before, kind of north of Karakova, but kind of south of the southern side of the big Russian salient they've been pushing towards Pokrovsk. And that suggests to me that the Ukrainians have probably actually retreated from that very, very exposed area that looked like it was developing into an encirclement. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about that. I'm guessing that means the Ukrainians have actually retreated from that area because we haven't heard about an actual encirclement there. But it suggests that the front has been flattened there and the Russians have made progress. Zolotoniva is elsewhere. That's right on that southern front to the west of Vuhledar, which the Russians took last week. So you can see the Russians putting in pressure on both sides of that east-south right angle. The Centre for Defence Strategies, Kiev-based defence think tank, says that Russian forces in the Pokrovsk direction have resumed using armoured vehicles during localised reconnaissance and assault operations south of Selidovia and Sokunya, which is also in that salient pushing towards Pokrovsk. It says that they are preparing to increase use of artillery and FPV drones and more reinforcements coming to that area. They understand from their analysis the current Russian immediate objective is to seize Selidovia. That's kind of at the tip of the salient pointing towards Pokrovsk. And after that, they'll begin their operations to assault Pokrovsk, Minohrad, which is a suburb of Pokrovsk, Korakova and Velika Novosilka. And they also say that they think that October and November will be the moment of maximum tensions for both sides in this year's campaign. So in other words, that the Russians are nearing culmination of this offensive and that the next, I suppose, 6 weeks or so is really going to be decisive. Away from the front line, a Russian attack on the city of Kharkiv has injured at least 21, including a child. That's from Governor Oleg Signabov via Telegram. 17 people in hospital. Russia's also put in attacks in the southern Kherson region, killing 1 and injuring 5, according to the local governor. That was in the village of Antonivka. And an oil base in Feodosia in occupied Crimea is burning for the second day after being hit by Ukrainian forces. So according to the Russian appointed governor there, that's Igor Tkachenko, he said that more than 1,000 people have been evacuated from the area. Firefighters are still working to put out the flames there. And last, but quite importantly, Ukraine's energy ministry says Russia has attacked energy infrastructure in 7 regions in the past 24 hours. They've reported power outages in Dnipropetrovsk, the Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Sumy, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Chernihiv oblasts in the past 24 hours. That sounds almost routine the way we put it, but of course we know that this winter campaign, this season of warfare is going to be very much about Ukraine trying to keep its heating and its lights on and Russia trying to put them out. So that is very much seems to be part of that narrative. That is pretty much where we are for military updates. James, you have been looking at the political and diplomatic front today.
Hi, Roland. Thanks for having me back on the pod. Let's start with the big news from yesterday afternoon. The Kremlin put out a statement mid-afternoon out of the blue saying that Vladimir Putin was going to fly to Ashgabat, that's the capital of Turkmenistan, on the southern border of Central Asia, former Soviet Central Asia, which borders Iran. And in Ashgabat on Friday, Putin's going to meet the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. He's been in power for a couple of months. This is going to be their first face-to-face meeting, actually, since Pezeshkian took over after the death of his predecessor in a helicopter crash. Now, this is big news, Roland. The Kremlin aide who briefed Russian media on this said they were going to discuss the sharply aggravated situation in the Middle East. This is the first meeting between Russia and Iranian leaders, the top level leaders, since Iran fired its salvo of 200-odd missiles at Israel last week after the assassination of the Hezbollah leader. So that's going to be top of their agenda. But of course, Russia and Iran have become such strong allies because of the war in Ukraine. Putin reached out to the Iranian leadership in 2022 when he needed diplomatic and weapon support, and he found it. And since then, they've become much closer. The weapon supplies from Iran to Russia have intensified. Not only is it very basic drones, these Shahed drones, but we've also found out, I think last month, they're now sending missiles across the Caspian Sea to Russia. In return, they get oil sent through Turkmenistan on trains, and they also get all this technical know-how. So we're really seeing what's likely to be a very important meeting on Friday in Ashgabat. It's been framed that Putin is traveling to Ashgabat to attend something called Interconnection of Times and Civilizations, the Basis of Peace and Development Forum. This is a Turkmen sort of jamboree, basically to celebrate the 300th anniversary of one of their great poets and philosophers. Not typically something that Putin would attend, but it's part of my job to monitor what happens in Turkmenistan. I'd never heard of this forum before, Roland. So The thinking with the analysts I've spoken to is this forum's been thrown together really as a fig leaf to disguise, to give an air of normality around this meeting. A handful of other regional leaders have also been invited from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to give the forum some international credibility as well. But really, this is really about Iran and Russia getting together. The meeting is going to be focused in the Middle East, but Ukraine will be in amongst the mix. So that really is the top item on the diplomatic agenda. Away from that, we've had some more news around something called BRICS. This is this economic club and was set up in 2009. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These were considered the 5 largest economies outside the Western sort of sphere. Since then, in January, they increased the size of it. They added Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and UAE. But what Russia is really going for, Russia's holding a BRICS summit, in Kazan in central Russia at the end of this month, 22nd of October to 24th of October. It is really looking for something like a BRICS Big Bang, if you want. It wants to increase the size of this economic bloc to make it a real anti-West unit to front up on the economic sphere against the West. And last night, I think it was, Cuba officially put in an application to join. It joins a growing list of potential joinees in October, which includes Turkey, Azerbaijan, Malaysia, Syria, and some others. At one point, Putin, I think last month, was saying there's going to be 34 countries join. Well, we haven't seen 34, but very important and interesting development there. In the Kremlin today, Putin's also hosting the head of CIS countries. These are sort of former Soviet countries. This is really a pro forma meeting, not expecting too much to come out of it, but it's all feeding in, rather like BRICS, feeding to this huge behind-the-scenes diplomatic effort that the Kremlin's been putting into winning credibility, winning allies on the international sphere. And in many ways, it's outplayed Ukraine on this front. If you remember, the peace summit in Switzerland a few months ago broke up without a clear, credible declaration against Russia. So the international sphere for the Kremlin is really important. And then lastly, the British government has sanctioned Russia's radiological, chemical and biological defense unit and its leader, Igor Kirillov, for using toxic chemical weapons of the type that were used in World War I, on battlefields in Ukraine. I mean, this again is rather pro forma. Other countries have previously already sanctioned this unit. So trying to ramp up a bit of pressure on Russia.
James, thank you very much for that. I'm now very excited to welcome Jørn Sund-Henriksen. I was going to introduce you. Maybe you should introduce yourself. I know you also run your own podcast in Norwegian, and you're the head, the founder, the leader of the Norwegian-Ukrainian Friendship Association, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Roland, and thank you for your invite here. It's a great honor to be on this podcast because, as you mentioned, we have our own Norwegian language podcast in Norway. It was started by me and Tormod Malvin Sæter in Nettavisen, which is one of the major news outlets in Norway. And it was directly inspired by you, by Ukraine the Latest, and especially by the work of David Knowles. So we are a very small part of David's massive legacy. So I would recommend to anyone out there in different countries that are listening to Ukraine the Latest and do like they do and do like we have done and just start your own podcast. Just start it and run with it. But as you said, I'm also the leader of the Norwegian-Ukrainian Friendship Association. And we're sort of a pro-Ukraine lobbyist in Norway. So I'm not a journalist myself. I'm just a contributor that speaks my mind. But in our association, we have gathered people from all major political parties in Norway that have that in common, that we support Ukraine and we work for Norway to give a stronger civil and military support for Ukraine.
Thank you so much for those kind words about David, actually, because of course you put out a video which was very touching when he died. So, thanks from the bottom of my heart and from everyone here. On what you just said about you're basically a lobbyist in a way to try and get Norway to take a stronger line on Ukraine. The reason we invited you on today, really, is you flagged to us a development about Norway's military support for Ukraine, which I believe you said is going to drop quite significantly. Could you talk us through this development, what it means, and how it's happened?
Yeah, so what happened yesterday was that the government published their proposal for next year's national budget in Norway. And in that proposal, compared to the aid this year, their proposal is about half. Now, there's a backstory to this, and part of that backstory is that we have for a long time criticized Norway for not doing enough to support Ukraine, and lately other Nordic countries, not their governments, but newspaper articles, both op-eds and journalists have started pointing out that Norway's support is quite small compared to the other Nordic countries. In February 2023, Norway announced the Nansen program, which was a 5-year program to support Ukraine, where we are supposed to support them with £1.1 billion each year, half and half between civilian and military aid. Since February 2023, the situation in Ukraine has changed dramatically. Just the military update that you started this episode with shows that Ukraine has a massive need of support. So we have been pushing the government to answer that situation with a dramatic increase in aid. And we have the opportunity to do that. We have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world because of our oil and gas exports. It is around £1,500. It has had an increase of about £150,000 because of the increased energy prices. So our oil and gas exports has increased in value. So there are several moral issues why we should support Ukraine more, because we have the opportunity. Now, Sweden and Denmark and Finland, they don't have this sovereign wealth fund like us, but they give more. Sweden takes up loans to support Ukraine. And Denmark has taken away some of their bank holidays to finance their support for Ukraine. So it's kind of frustrating for us that the Norwegian government isn't open to taking a little bit off the top of their savings account to support Ukraine. So in April of this year, the Prime Minister announced that he would speak to the leaders of the other parties in Parliament and come with an increase to the support. And they announced a very meek 360 million increase, slightly higher, or about 500 million increase in April. There was some backlash to that, saying that this is not enough. And they sort of agreed and said, well, in the autumn, when we handle our state budget, then we're going to evaluate the whole program and roll out an increase. And this time, they announced that the increase would be £360 million, which is very weak compared to our ability and what Ukraine needs. And at the same time, they said they would expand the program, but in the end, so they added 3 more years, from 2028 to 2030. And in this sort of very dramatic situation that Ukraine is in right now, we feel that talking about what we're going to spend in 2030 is not really relevant to the debate. So the government has had a lot of criticism for this. So it's part of the trend. So we weren't really that surprised, but it's a telling tale when they're announcing the budget for next year, and it's half of what the support will be this year. The support this year, 2024, from Norway is about £2 billion, and next year it will be 1.1. And though they say that they can increase it when we add to our budgets in May, but that would have effect in late 2025. And Ukraine needs our support now.
I'm wondering if you could put it slightly in context. I mean, firstly, if we put it in the kind of international context, do you see this very much as part of a kind of wider trend of governments tightening their belts? I think we had reports about, Germany cutting its projected assistance as well. And could you also put it in a Norwegian context for us? Views of the Ukraine war tend to vary from nation to nation, even within the broader, let's call it the Western alliance, right? There are very hawkish nations like, I suppose, Poland, the Baltic states, Britain to a lesser extent. There are people kind of slightly more cautious, saying let's throw kind of Germany, Italy, France in there. And then you have the Viktor Orbáns, the Hungaries and Slovakia of this world. Where would you put Norwegian, I don't know, domestic as well as, just public as well as political opinion on that scale?
That's a very good question, because we've been asking ourselves this very question over and over again. Why are we so behind the curve? Because if you look at Germany, there is a trend that they're scaling back like we do, but we also know that Olaf Scholz has said that he wants the other European nations to do more if Germany is supposed to foot the bill to such a large extent. So he is sort of demanding that the rest of us step up. And we're against the trend in the Nordic countries, because the other Nordic countries are escalating their support for Ukraine. It seems like their perspective is linked to what does Ukraine need. And we had a very interesting debate between the Nordic countries. 12th of September, there was a debate in Copenhagen with all the major TV stations in the Nordic countries, having a debate between politicians and researchers between all those countries. They spoke about the security situation in their country differently than we do in Norway. I think there's a lack of understanding of the threat in the Norwegian public debate. That said, there is a massive support in the Norwegian people for aid to Ukraine. We know this both because our organization has done opinion polls and others have done opinion polls as well. And there's a majority of the voters among all the parties, even the far left party Rødt, which is sort of former communist party, even those voters support military aid to Ukraine. And every political party in the Norwegian parliament supports aid. So there's absolutely a political room for the government to do more. And I don't think it's because of the Labour Party, because there's a lot of people in the Norwegian Labour Party that are frustrated with the lack of support. I was a member of this party for 15 years myself. I'm not anymore, but it's also the party of Jens Stoltenberg, the former NATO General Secretary that has been a guest on your podcast. So the party and parliament and the people of Norway all support increased aid for Ukraine. So I think we have a two-party government, the Labour Party and the Centre Party, and my view, and I'm speculating here, is that I don't think the two leaders of those parties, I don't think they see a very big political upside for supporting Ukraine and spending money on that. So they're not politically engaged in that. And we know that individuals matter. Just look at Boris Johnson and his role. And it's not just because the UK is the UK, but he was personally vested in this support and this conflict. And I think that's part of what's lacking in Norway. And there's quite a damning quote from the meeting in Parliament with our Prime Minister Gahr Støre met with the other party leaders. And he is reported to have said, we have several sources on this, that he is comfortable with Norway not taking the lead financially, because if we gave more, he would worry that other countries might give less. Well, that doesn't really show solidarity neither to Ukraine nor the other Nordic countries that are footing the bill, so to speak.
Interesting. I mean, I suppose it's kind of a familiar story from, many politicians across the West as they weigh up the pros and cons at the ballot box. I'm kind of surprised by that, because I suppose I could have assumed, or I did assume, that the war in Ukraine might have, sent a bit of an electric shock through Scandinavia, given that, Norway in particular, you are literally kind of NATO's northern flank. You share a border with Russia. Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO. There's been a big shift in the Baltic, Nordic kind of Scandinavian security posture. Does it feel like kind of the security calculus has changed as a result of the war?
Yes, absolutely. I would say a broad spectrum of the security apparatus in Norway, and researchers and people in different part of Norwegian defense colleges and such, they are all in agreement that our security situation is difficult, it's strained, it's going to be influenced by whomever wins the presidential election in the US in a month's time. But there is also a consensus that the most efficient way to increase our security situation is to help Ukraine win the war. But it doesn't seem to break through to the government. The government published and Parliament also ratified earlier this year the long-term defense plan for Norway, which has a plan of doubling our defense spending, which is all well and good. It's something we absolutely should do. We should probably do more than double it. But it literally says in that plan that the most important thing, not in solidarity with Ukraine, but for our own security situation, is to support Ukraine. So even though we're going to double our defense spending, the plan says that it's even more important to increase our support for Ukraine. But that hasn't been followed up. So in the degree that there is a public debate about this, it's a consensus that the situation in Ukraine influences our security, and that not because of Ukraine, but because of our own interests, we should increase our aid to them. But it's not followed up by the government, and in the large scheme of news in Norway, there's more coverage of reality shows and weddings, royal weddings and things than security issues. So I think those that work within this field have woken up. We just need to wake up the rest of the population, and especially the government.
Thanks so much, Jørn. James, I think you've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, I do, Roland. Great to have you on, Jørn. I had a great year based in Oslo 20 years ago as a young Reuters correspondent, so very fond of Norway. One of the big sort of side stories of this whole conflict with Ukraine is the cutting of gas contracts, European gas contracts with Russia, and the switch to asking places like Azerbaijan to up its gas supplies to Europe. I was wondering what the potential uplift in Norwegian gas production could be, if that's a possibility, to increase gas supplies from Norway to Europe. That's one of my questions. And the second question is, I know that Norway is building or has plans to build a fence along its short border with Russia in the Arctic. Why is that exactly? Is it a security threat? I remember December last year, we wrote a lot about the Kremlin forcing migrants over the border with Finland, if Norway is worried about that.
Yeah, first of all, to the increased gas production, it's been a few years since I worked with energy politics in Norway, so I'm not very up to date with that. I think we've sort of reached the ceiling of our production capacity unless we find a lot of new fields. But it is interesting when you look at the politics in Norway, because we have a Green Party in Norway, which is one of the parties that is the clearest supportive of Ukraine. And their whole party is funded on the idea that we need to cut carbon-based energy and switch to renewables. But they have said in the short term, security is more important, Ukraine is more important. So even they support increasing Norwegian gas production in the short term to secure delivery to Europe. So that's a sort of an interesting effect of the war and the public discussion in Norway. When it comes to defense, we've had in the past some situations where Russia is testing us, but by sending a lot of migrants over the border. I don't know if it's a direct response to that, or it's just the sort of generally worsening security situation in Norway that has made the government decide that it's rational to have a more physical barrier along the border. We know that some of the Baltic nations are doing the same, and I guess that's more of a realization of a deteriorating security situation for all of us that are neighbours to Russia.
Thanks so much, Jørn. I was wondering if you've been up there and you could tell us about it. I remember when I was a very young correspondent in Moscow for some reason. It's a long story, but I ended up there on that border in Kirkenes and having to kind of basically hitchhike from there back to Murmansk across the border. And it feels like the edge of the world up there. You know, you're so far away from anything really. I was wondering, I suppose, and is it true even for Norwegian people? If most people are living kind of down in Oslo and stuff, does all that, that Russian border just feel miles and miles away and on another planet?
Well, not really, because we've had, and I think that influences the government a bit. We've had quite a good relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union as well. So the normalizations of relations in the 90s went quite fast for Norway. We have this sort of border passes so that people living close to the border on each side can just travel freely across the border. Murmansk is quite a big city, so there's been a lot of economic cooperation between Kirkenes and Murmansk up there. So it's been quite an open border, and we haven't seen Russia as a threat for a long time. And I think as a collective, and especially the government, has had sort of a pride around that we have, or at least we thought we had, sort of especially good relationship with Russia, better relationship than the rest of the Western world. So with the invasions of Georgia and Ukraine in 2014, it was sort of a rough awakening for us. And with the full-scale invasion as well, it has really gone downhill. So I think it's taken longer for Norway than, for example, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark to wrap our head around who our neighbor really is. But I can understand that you feel that it's sort of at the edge of the world when you're up there. But someplace I would recommend going, if you really want that feeling, is Svalbard, Spitsbergen. I visited Barentsburg up there, which is a Russian mining settlement on Svalbard. And there you really feel that you're at the edge of the world. We took snowmobiles there. There's like a half an hour from Longyearbyen to Barentsburg. And while you're traveling there, you understand this is the real wilderness. There's just nothing out there in any direction. And suddenly there's a small town with a Lenin statue, and there was a volleyball tournament inside. So it's really an absurd place to visit. And it's also geopolitically one of the most interesting places in the world in the coming years, I would say, because I fear, and many with me, that this is one of the places where Russia might consider testing NATO at some point just to see our reaction, because it's a demilitarized zone. It's high up in the north, very small population, and it's part of Norway, but Russia sort of questions our claim to Spitsbergen. It's demilitarized, but their helicopter airport up there has a runway that is exactly the length that you need to land a MiG-29. So there's a hint for us.
Coming up, we hear the final thoughts from the team. Thank you so much, chaps. We are beginning to run out of time. Let's move to the final thoughts. James Kilner.
Roland, I mean, obviously this Putin-Pezeshkian meeting on Friday in Ashgabat is a major focus. That is serious high-level diplomacy going on there. Away from that, I keep banging on about this whenever I come on the podcast. If the news on the front line in Ukraine is dire, is poor for Ukraine and supporters of Ukraine, the news in the Russian economy is dire for the Kremlin and for supporters of Vladimir Putin. There's a torrent of news almost every day when I go through my news reading in the morning about how terrible the Russian economy is going. Only this morning, there was a news item saying that Russia's coal mining sector, one of the backbones of its industry, is facing its worst crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91. This is because it's lost a lot of its markets, its export markets, and Western sanctions, etc. It's now producing about 27% less than it was at its peak only 4 years ago. That in itself is a crisis. There's more news. There's a huge lack of labor in Russia because of the inflated salaries that Ministry of Defense is offering for soldiers, need for frontline soldiers to feed into its sort of meat grinder mass infantry tactics machine on the front line, etc., has really dried up workforces. And at the same time that the Russian army is sucking in men for its project in Ukraine, its war in Ukraine, the Kremlin is under pressure to put up barriers for the usual stream of migrant labours from Central Asia to come into Russia to take the jobs. So you've got two things going on here. You've got the war in Ukraine sucking men away from industry, and you've got a lack of migrant labour coming in. And almost every day someone is complaining about it. Today it was Yandex. There was a story about Yandex, which is the Google/Uber of Russia. They do the cab hailing apps, etc. in Moscow. And they're saying they're going to have a massive spike in prices because there isn't the migrant labourers driving taxis anymore. One small example, my takeaway, my finishing point today is Roland, is to also watch the Russian economy. That is the Kremlin's Achilles heel.
Thank you, James. Jørn, Sund-Henriksen, would you like the very final words today?
Yes, thank you so much. Something that we've discussed a bit on our podcast, and which I think is important to think about, is that when we say that Ukraine's fight is our fight, it's not solidarity. They are actually fighting our fight because it's a battle between autocracy and democracy. And the kinetic war in Ukraine, you can know where the border between those two is very concretely by the meter, so to speak. But there is a trend in Europe that worries me, where the border between autocracy and democracy is not as clear. We have the trend in Hungary, but also Slovakia. And I've spoken a bit with civil society in Slovakia that is very worried because the sort of processes that Viktor Orban has done in Hungary to reduce civil liberties and to reduce democratic institutions there in 6 years, that has happened in 6 months in Slovakia since the election in late 2023. And like in Georgia and like they have in Belarus and Hungary and Russia, they are doing a foreign agents law in Slovakia as well. And we have the elections in Austria that is quite worrying, and the same trend in Eastern Germany and several places in Europe. So there's sort of an anti-democratic trend. The civil society people I met in Slovakia said that the sort of last stand of defense that they have now for their democracy is a free press. To have a free press that is sort of run by editors and an editorial press is a very important part of democracy, and we shouldn't take that for granted. It's the last stand in Slovakia. It might be in our countries as well at some point in the future. So I would just like to hail the work that you do as journalists and tell people all over Europe and the world that you can do your part in protecting democracy by subscribing to editorial news and read it, watch it, listen to it, and spread fact-based news because they're under attack. It's not something that has happened organically. There's someone that systematically wants to attack the free press because they're a threat, and they look at truth as a threat. Journalists are important to defend democracy and support them by subscribing to them.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.